Heroic last stands have taken place in battles throughout history, usually in brutal hand-to-hand fighting. King Leonidas' 300 Spartans and their 7,000 Greek allies at Thermopylae. General Custer's outfought 7th Cavalry at Little Bighorn, and the epic British defense of Rorke's Drift. Last stands have been defined as military situations in which a body of troops holds a defensive position in the face of overwhelming and virtually insurmountable odds. Troops might make a last stand due to a sense of duty, because they are defending a tactically crucial point, to buy time to enable a trapped army, person, or group of people to escape, due to fear of execution if captured, or to protect their ruler or leader. Last stands in battles have often been completely slaughtered by furious and vengeful opponents. But they have had survivors, as at the disastrous Battle of Arnhem in Holland during World War II. The 1st British Parachute Regiment were cut off and armed only with light guns, but still repulsed 2 Waffen SS Panzer divisions for 9 days. They fought an incredibly brave and bloody series of engagements with their ruthless enemy, even hand-to-hand. But the regiment ceased to exist as a fighting force. Out of 9,000 paras, 6,000 were POWs or missing. 1,200 were killed and less than 2,000 escaped. Amongst scores of other battle honors, 2 Victoria Crosses were awarded to the unit. Forces that have performed such feats hold a special place in military history. Many were mere boys, stumbling over their mutilated friends in their own last moments of life. Such bloody historical events stand out even amongst the most gruesome battles ever fought. Many of the doomed recipients were in a hopeless situation. They knew what was coming, but still fought to the death anyway. There are too many examples to name here, but I shall highlight a few that still draw our respect or empathy even today. The climactic battle of the First English Civil War began on a misty morning. Oliver Cromwell's new model army of 7,000 parliamentarian Roundheads with 6,000 cavalry faced the Royalist army, 3,000 men and 4,000 mounted cavaliers under King Charles I. The Royalist infantry and Prince Rupert's entire cavalry charged, the latter initially being repelled by Ireton's Parliament cavalry, which then turned towards the Royalist centre, who were pushing the Roundheads back. Rupert then routed the Parliament infantry left and dashed from the field after them. Ireton's regiments were saved from destruction by the fire from Oakey's dragoons, who both charged in from the extreme left flank. Meanwhile, Cromwell's disciplined cavalry on the right routed the outnumbered Royalist horse, then turned and trapped the Royalist infantry in the centre. Charles could only watch helplessly from a nearby ridge as his army crumbled and panicked. Prince Rupert, his nephew, was still miles away raiding the enemy's baggage train. Many of the defeated Royalists threw down their arms and tried to surrender, others simply broke and were cut down as they fled. Not so Rupert's own Bluecoats. These were 500 tough and fearless West countrymen, so famed for their fanatical fighting during the Civil War that even their enemies praised their bravery. But by 1645 these battle-hardened veterans were much depleted. Possibly delaying the defeat to enable their comrades' escape, they alone conducted a brilliant fighting retreat against appalling odds and, despite repeated vicious onslaughts from all sides by cavalry, musket, pike and sword, these tough veterans refused to yield and battled on hopelessly, constantly losing men. Successive waves of parliamentarian attacks increased as the Bluecoats limped in a loose mass across the bloody fields. But it was eventually all over. The entire regiment was wiped out. Alexander the Great's invincible army had fought and won numerous battles, sieges and campaigns across Asia against the Persian king Darius, ferocious mountain tribes, Greek traitor mercenaries and other quashed enemies. He now split the Macedonian army into 2 parts. General Parmenion took one half, along the royal road to circumnavigate the mountains, whilst Alexander himself took 15,000 of his best men and cavalry along
the route towards Persis,
which required traversing the Persian gates, a narrow, windy mountain pass with rough terrain that lent itself easily to ambush. Unbeknown to them, 2,000 Persian enemies led by Ariobarzanes, a Persian military commander, were hiding in wait along the cliff tops. Alexander had neglected to send scouts ahead. Attacking Alexander at the Persian gates would force the Macedonian army to use other routes to invade Persia proper, all of which would allow King Darius more time to field another army, replacing huge losses at battles such as Granicus, Issus and Gaugamela, and possibly stop Alexander's invasion altogether. As Alexander's army snaked far enough through the pass, the Persians suddenly rained down boulders on them from the northern slopes. From the southern slope, Persian archers fired lethal arrow storms at them. The Macedonians suffered heavy casualties, losing entire platoons at a time. He attempted to withdraw, but the terrain and their still advancing rear guard made an orderly retreat impossible. Alexander was forced to leave his dead behind to save the rest of his army, a mark of deep disgrace to the Macedonians and Greeks, who highly valued the recovery and proper burial of their fallen. Sources such as Curtius and Arrian both report that by interrogating Persian captives, Alexander's general, Craterus, succeeded in encircling the Persians in a pincer attack with Ptolemy and broke through their defenses. Alexander and his elite contingent then attacked Ariobarzanes from above in a surprise attack, until the Persians could no longer block the pass. The Persian defenders were all killed as the Macedonians exacted furious revenge upon them for the slaughter they had suffered the previous day. According to some accounts, Ariobarzanes and his surviving companions were trapped, but rather than surrender, they charged straight into the Macedonian lines. One account states that Ariobarzanes was killed in the last charge. Others say that many Persians broke through their attackers only to find the city gates cruelly closed by Tiridates, a Persian noble and guardian of the royal treasury under Darius, who had been in secret contact with Alexander the Great. The hapless Persians then returned to fight Alexander's army to the death. In the early days of World War II, Hitler unleashed his Wehrmacht and the elite, ruthless panzer divisions in a terrifying blitzkrieg across Belgium and into France. By the 26th of May, 1940, the battered British Expeditionary Force and the French First Army were bottled up in a huge corridor 60 miles deep and 15 miles wide, stretching to the North French coast. Most of the British were still over 40 miles from Dunkirk, with the French farther south. The German blitzkrieg had stunned the Franco-British armies, and tens of thousands of Allied troops headed towards, or waited on the beaches to be evacuated by Allied shipping, their only hope, which also incredibly included flotillas of civilian fishing boats. They were bombed and strafed by the Luftwaffe constantly. In order to prevent a horrific slaughter and save the Allied armies with which to continue the war, it was essential to buy time to allow the 338,000 troops to escape to England. It was decided by British and French army commanders to set up a robust defensive perimeter in a huge radial arc 8 miles inland, whilst the outnumbered and overstretched RAF fighters did the same above them. The French and British were each given flanks of this defensive pocket to hold. Their orders,
stand and fight to the last man.
Effectively, many of these brave young men were being sentenced to death. The Royal Scots, as had many other Allied forces, been in continuous action for weeks, had travelled over 200 miles and had suffered heavy casualties. Now, at Le Paradis 30 miles from Dunkirk, tired, depleted, low on ammunition and very lightly equipped to defend against an armoured and air attack, they took up positions and waited tensely. Racing towards them were the Waffen SS Death's Head Panzer Division, one of merciless, fanatical Nazi units who had, and would, commit sickening atrocities. During these few days, there were numerous other acts of considerable and selfless bravery. On the 25th of May, the full fury of the German blitzkrieg bore down on the British regiments, especially the Royal Norfolk Regiment fighting nearby. For 3 days, the Royal Scots fought a ferocious defense against incredible odds. Eventually, through horrendous attrition, they were fighting in isolated small units. Only the very brave, but fatal action of Major Allen avoided the battalion from being overrun. He held up the German advance single-handedly with a Bren gun until he was killed. Their ferocious resistance at Paradis inflicted heavy losses on the enemy, and seriously delayed the Germans' advance, infuriating the SS units, but allowing thousands of British troops to reach the beaches of Dunkirk and escape. 141 had been killed, over 350 badly wounded, over 290 became prisoners of war. A German officer stated, "They fought like lions." The weary RAF fighter pilots, also having suffered heavy losses, were also hastily recalled back to defend England against the expected onslaught of the experienced Luftwaffe. Sadly, some of those men captured by the SS were herded together with mostly the shattered Royal Norfolks and others. Marched to a vast pit, they were beaten with rifle butts and then killed en masse with machine guns. The groaning survivors were bayoneted. Such awful incidents were the tragic cost of keeping Britain in the war.
Everybody knows the Battle of Hastings, 1066. King Harold of England was hit in the eye by an arrow and invader Duke William of Normandy won. True, but it was far more complex, far longer lasting, and was a total bloodbath. Given that most battles of the time only lasted an average of about 2 hours, Hastings was indeed an unusually long battle, as the Duke's own chaplain, William of Poitiers, wrote later. It was also merciless, as no prisoners would be taken, only vicious hand-to-hand slaughter. William and Harold knew each other from a few years before, when the Normans say that Harold swore an oath to support the Duke's claim to the English succession, but broke it. English clerics and nobles knew that any oath outside of the land was invalid, and only the king and the Witan could decide the succession. But the die was cast. William's aim was simple: to wipe out the English army before nightfall. The Norman French, if not wiped out in the battle, would then be forced to retreat to their temporary wooden stockade they had built after landing, then be starved out and captured or slain. Harold's was simply to hold the hilltop, blocking the enemy's march to London, until nightfall. Although in truth, neither commander could expect any kind of mercy. Harold's army was composed of about 7,000 fighting men. The feared, lightly clad civilian farmers who were called up to fight when needed, and thanes, landed nobles who were sworn to their lord or king, and heavily armed. Harold also had the professional Housecarl warriors. Armed with the razor-sharp 2-handed 6-feet-long Dane axe, these highly trained and elite fearless warriors were the SAS of their day, clad in chainmail and housed and fed by their king or earl and sworn to die for him. With Harold's 2 brothers, Gurth and Leofwin, there were probably 2,000 to 3,000 Housecarls. These men, and their axes, could take down both horse and rider with one blow. Their fearsome reputation was well deserved. Only 3 weeks before, they and the Thanes had been the spearhead of Harold's army, which had wiped out over 90% of a ferocious Norse Viking invasion army. It was these men that formed the formidable front wall of shields at the top of Senlac Hill, perhaps half a mile wide, and around the center, where Harold was. Testament to the sheer brutality of the fighting is depicted in the Bayeux tapestry. In its lower columns you can see severed heads and limbs, mutilated bodies and mangled horses. The awful sights, the sounds of men screaming, weapons cleaving and the smells of fear and blood etc. must have been the stuff of nightmares. William's army was about the same size. Normans, French and Bretons in the marshy valley below the English, were composed of firstly bowmen, then tough chain-mailed infantry and the much vaunted elite cavalry behind them. These formations were in turn launched uphill against the stubborn English shield wall, each violently repulsed back downhill in ferocious English storms of various thrown missiles, or actual fighting at the top. This vicious cycle would go on in a bitter rate of attrition throughout the day, with the shield wall gradually being frittered away as the English were killed by the fighting, or by feigned retreat cavalry tactics, and the men holding the defensive wall drew closer together in order to close the gaping gaps of the dead. But the shield wall still held strong. William, personally unhorsed several times, which panicked his entire army and nearly broke, was forced to change his battle plan. The Norman arrows had been simply hitting the enemy's shields, or flying harmlessly overhead. Now though, William ordered his bowmen not only to fire directly at the shield wall, but also simultaneously fire in a steep trajectory over it, so that their arrows rained down vertically upon the English. Nobody could block two directions at once. Each continuous volley, interspersed with savage cavalry and infantry assaults, depleted the English ranks. Englishmen were now being struck from two different directions, dying at a faster rate. But Norman casualties were still high. Sources record that the English were packed so densely that the dead could not fall. Eventually, Norman cavalry were able to penetrate the English defences here and there and inflict real damage as the wall of shields slowly disintegrated. Cries of Harold's death rapidly spread, and the Fyrdsmen panicked and broke, fleeing back to the trees of the Andred Sweald, some to hide, others to die of their wounds. But the Housecarls did neither. They fulfilled their oaths and fought feverishly to the death around their stricken king, now writhing in agony. The Duke's advancing army now closed in for the kill. Some cavalry were tasked to kill Harold, others to pursue the fleeing English Fyrdsmen. Fighting desperately, as night fell, the last stubborn Housecarls, heavily outnumbered and completely exhausted, were finally cut down. The legendary Macedonian king, Philip II, father of Alexander, later the Great, had rapidly strengthened and expanded his kingdom into Thrace and the northern coast of the Aegean Sea. He had brought peace to a war-torn Greece and to many of the fiercely independent city-states. His immense power was perceived as a threat, especially in Athens. This prompted the formation of an alliance of a few southern Greek states to oppose him, led by the militarily inexperienced Athenian army and their new ally, Thebes. At the start of 339 BC, the Thebans and Athenians had seized Philip's garrison town of Nicaea near Thermopylae, but Philip slipped his large army into central Greece anyway, and the stalemate continued. The Sacred Band, their elite hand-picked warriors, 150 pairs of male lovers famed for many heroic battle honors, including the breaking of Sparta's domination. Their main military function was as shock troops, to cripple the enemy by engaging and killing their best men and leaders in battle. According to Diodorus, the Macedonian army numbered roughly 30,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry. Philip took command of the right wing of the Macedonian army and placed his 18-year-old son Alexander in command of the left wing, accompanied by a group of his father's experienced generals. Modern estimates agree that the Greek allied army was approximately equal in size to Philip's. The Athenians took up positions on the left wing, the Thebans on the right opposite Alexander's elite companion cavalry, and the other allies in the center. Details of the battle itself are scarce, with Diodorus providing the only formal account. He says that, once joined, the battle was hotly contested for a long time and many fell on both sides, so that for a while the struggle permitted hopes of victory to both. He then recounts that the young Alexander, his heart set on showing his father his prowess, succeeded in rupturing the allied line aided by his companions, and eventually put the right wing to flight. Meanwhile, Philip advanced in person against the left wing and also put it to flight. The traditional hoplite infantry was no match for the novel long-speared Macedonian phalanx, even for the sacred band. They stood and fought where their other comrades had broken and fled. Although surrounded and vastly overwhelmed, they refused to surrender. They fought ferociously against Alexander's elite companion cavalry, and now Philip's men as they wheeled around. Plutarch suggests that all 300 of the sacred band, having previously been seen as invincible, were massacred at the battle.